The day was gray, heavy, as the entire sky conspired against me. I walked slowly along the uneven sidewalk, my cane rhythmically tapping against concrete, each tap echoing like a reminder that I existed. People hurried past, oblivious of the way I passed, and a fine rain began to soak my worn overcoat. That's when I heard a shrill laugh, sharp as a blade. A man, perhaps my age or a little younger, approached with a mocking smile, pointing at my cane. "Look at that. Old age arrived early, huh? How sad to see a veteran like this." Those words struck me before I could even react. I felt the weight of all the battles I had fought, not just the physical ones, but the internal ones carried like invisible scars. My heart raced, but my body, marked and hardened by years of service, stubbornly refused to move too quickly. He continued, relentless, drawing curious glances, some laughing, others looking away, uncomfortable with the situation but unable to intervene. The sound of the cane against the floor seemed louder than any scream I could utter. Inside, something roared, a mixture of anger and sadness. My mind automatically went back to the battlefields, to the days when every step could be my last. But there I was alone, being judged by a man who had never known the true weight of courage. I could feel his eyes, his teeth clench in a sarcastic smile, as he mocked every tense muscle in my body, as if he had the power to reduce an entire life to a single moment of scorn. And then, something unexpected happened. A car pulled up beside the curb. The driver looked at me and then at the man, confusion in his eyes. The tension in the air became almost physical, as if the space between us was charged with electricity. I felt the silence of the city spread around us, each person frozen in that instant. I took a deep breath, feeling the rain wet my face, and at that moment I realized this humiliation would not go unpunished. Something inside me awakened, an old instinct of dignity that cannot be broken by the laughter of others. The man continued to mock, but now there was a shadow in his smile. Perhaps a premonition, perhaps just curiosity. People stopped walking. Conversation ceased, and a heavy silence filled the street. My hand gripped my cane tightly, and the memory of the scars, the lost friends, the war, and everything I had lived through began to take clear shape in my mind. I knew this story wouldn't end there, that something would happen that would change everyone's perception around me. And it was in that instant, in those seconds that seemed like hours, that the first breath of justice began to form. I was no longer just an old man with a cane. I was a veteran, and my story was about to be revealed. My name is James Holloway, and every scar on my body tells a story no one wants to hear. Before the war, I was just an ordinary young man, full of dreams and simple plans. Work, get married, have children. But life has its own rules, and in a short time everything changed. When I was drafted, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I left my family, my friends, and the comfort of predictable routine to face something I could never have fully imagined. The first day on the battlefield was a shock that no words could describe. The smell of gunpowder mixed with damp clay, the metallic sound of gunfire echoing through the hills, the cries of the wounded. All of this was etched into my mind like an invisible tattoo. I quickly learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather acting despite it. Each mission we accomplished demanded more than physical strength. It required mental resilience, the ability to adapt, to make decisions that could mean life or death for men who became brothers in arms. I watched friends fall beside me, and the feeling of helplessness burned like iron in my veins. Each face that disappeared in the explosions or in the silence of death left a permanent mark. I became someone who learned to move fast, to react instinctively, but at the same time to carry a silent pain, invisible to those who have never been in combat. I learned to hide tears, to swallow screams, to keep walking even when everything inside me screamed to give up. The war shaped not only my body, but also my mind. The nights were the worst. Even after returning to the barracks, or later, home, the sounds of battle haunted me. Every creaking door, every distant thunderclap, every siren on the horizon brought back intense memories that ripped me from reality. The nightmares were constant, as if the war were still raging inside me, even when the world around seemed calm. When I was injured, the loss of mobility and the need to use a cane changed not only my body, but the way the world saw me. To many, I was just a scarred old man, a frail man trying to exist in a world that values strength and appearance above all else. But every step I take with this cane is a reminder of everything I've survived, of every moment I refuse to give up, of every brother I didn't have the chance to protect. After leaving military service, I tried to rebuild my life. I worked odd jobs, tried to reconnect with society, but something always fell off. People looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, and I learned to ignore condescending smiles and malicious whispers. But every laugh, every disrespectful comment, rekindles that silent pain I've carried since my battle days. Today, I stand here, walking through streets that seem indifferent to my existence, trying to maintain my dignity in a world that often ignores the value of experience. My cane is not merely physical support. It is a symbol of resistance, of survival, of the silent courage that has defined my entire life. Each step I take is a reminder of who I was and what I am still capable of facing, even when mocking glances and cruel words try to reduce me to nothing. And that is precisely why I am at this point in the city on this rainy day. I am not just walking. I am remembering everything, feeling each memory as if it were alive beside me, aware that any moment could bring another battle. But now, it is not war that threatens my life. It is the ignorance and contempt of those who will never understand what it truly means to fight and survive. The man who ridiculed me on that sidewalk wasn't just a stranger. He represented everything I had tried to overcome after the war. His mocking smile was more than a gesture of derision. It was a direct provocation, a silent challenge to my dignity. And in that instant, I realized there was no way to ignore it. The surrounding crowd, curious but passive, heightened my discomfort, and I felt a wave of frustration rise through my body, mingling with the rain that was now falling harder. He took a step forward, pointing his cane with a kind of almost childlike arrogance. "Need help walking, Grandpa," he said, his voice laden with mockery, drawing a few nervous laughs from passers-by. The sound of those laughs cut through my chest like invisible blades. Each word seemed to transform my tired body into something smaller, less relevant, as if my entire life of struggles and sacrifices could be discarded with a sarcastic comment. My mind went back to all the times I faced impossible situations, nights where survival depended on seconds, battles where the lives of my comrades were literally in my hands. And there, in that instant, I realized I was facing another battle, not one against armed enemies, but against the ignorance and indifference of the civilian world. I felt an internal pressure, a mixture of anger and despair, reminiscent of the weight of military training. Every muscle in my body tense, ready to react, but restrained by the cane, I needed to stay upright. The man continued provoking me, now drawing dangerously close, attracting stares and whispers from the crowd. I felt the pressure of all eyes on me, as if I were being judged not for what I had done or lived through, but for what I appeared to be, just an old man with a cane. The injustice of the situation hit me hard, and I remembered all the times similar injustices had occurred, in the barracks, on the streets, in civilian life, when no one cared to understand what really happened behind the appearance. Then, something unexpected happened inside me. It wasn't irrational anger, nor an impulsive thought. It was the awareness of my own history, of the silent courage that had brought me here. I took a deep breath, feeling the cane firmly in my hands, and began to project a presence that could not be ignored. The mocking man noticed a change. My eyes, tired but determined, stared at him with intensity he hadn't expected. A heavy silence settled in, broken only by the sound of the rain and the constant tapping of my cane on the wet ground. The tension in the air was palpable. The audience, previously passive, now felt the weight of the situation. Some looked away, others whispered amongst themselves, and I could sense that something was about to happen. The injustice, which until that moment had seemed imminent and overwhelming, began to transform into a critical point, the thin line between humiliation and revelation. Every step the man took was now calculated, as if he perceived, even vaguely, that his provocation had a price. At that moment, I understood that the conflict wasn't just with him. It was with everyone's perception around me. My story, my scars, and my courage needed to emerge, needed to be acknowledged, before contempt became a permanent sentence. And while the man laughed even louder, attracting glances of temporary approval, I knew I was about to turn the situation upside down. Something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change everyone's perception on that street and make my presence respected, not just tolerated. The humiliation was just the first move, and the game was about to turn. What nobody knew, what he could never imagine, was that behind that old body, behind the cane he ridiculed, lay a lifetime of courage, sacrifice, and experience that could not be diminished by cruel words. And at that moment, I took a deep breath, feeling every muscle ready to transform injustice into something deeper, an opportunity to show who I truly am. The man continued to taunt me, moving closer and closer, as if he took pleasure in turning my presence into a spectacle. Look, everyone, this is a great war hero. He can barely walk without that ridiculous cane. He laughed loudly, drawing the attention of everyone around. Some passers-by stopped to look, others approached out of curiosity, and I felt the weight of all the stares, some of pity, others of silent judgment. The humiliation was palpable, a shadow that seemed to grow over me with each laugh. I felt my body stiffen, every muscle tensed, the cane firm in my hand, as my mind reviewed every battle scene. Every moment I faced enemies far more dangerous than an arrogant man on the street. But there, the danger wasn't physical. It was moral, emotional, and somehow more cruel. Every word he spoke made my memory burn, bringing to the surface the feeling of powerlessness I had always feared feeling outside the battlefield. "You think you're brave, don't you?" he continued, pointing disdainfully. Just a pathetic old man trying to feel important. The crowd began to laugh, and some young people recorded the scene with their cell phones, probably thinking they were witnessing something funny. The feeling of invisibility, of being reduced to an object of ridicule, hit me hard. I felt the mixture of anger and shame bubbling inside me, and for a moment I almost lost control. But something stopped me. It was the awareness of everything I had achieved, of every battle, of every friend I had lost, of every night that fear kept me awake. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight physically. My presence, my story would be my weapons. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold rain wetting my face, and decided that I wouldn't be just another victim of other people's laughter. Noticing my silence, he took an even closer step, leaning in with a sadistic smile. "Come on, tell us all, what's it like to fight when you're so fragile?" His mockery seemed tailor-made to break me, but at the same time it stirred something within me, a silent determination, a desire to show that my life had value, that my experiences couldn't be dismissed by a cruel comment. The crowd, once curious, began to feel the tension in the air. Some looked away, uncertain. Others continued watching, expecting a comical outcome. But there was something different now, a weight of expectation, as if everyone was beginning to realize that this old man with a cane wasn't as simple as he seemed. I felt the breath of the man nearby, mixed with the smell of rain and wet asphalt, and for a moment, the whole world seemed suspended. My mind drifted back to the battlefields, to the adrenaline coursing through my veins, to the fear I had learned to control. Each of his laughs became an opportunity, each mocking glance a reminder that my life was more than appearances. My chest was tight, my anger contained, but my eyes shone with something he could never understand. The story I carried, silent but powerful, was about to emerge. The man, unaware of what was to come, continued to mock, each word more cruel than the last. But deep down he sensed, even if vaguely, that something was changing. The silence that began to form among the spectators indicated that something was about to happen, something that no one could ignore. And it was at that moment that I understood. The public humiliation I was suffering was not the end. It was merely the prelude to something greater, the preparation for the revelation of who I truly am. My story, my sacrifices, and my courage would no longer be ignored. Each cruel laugh, each despicable comment, made the turning point even more necessary, more intense, more satisfying. The crowd was now expectant, and the overconfident man continued with his arrogance, not realizing that the moment he ridiculed me would become the very instant his perception would be completely shattered. The entire city, without even knowing it yet, was about to discover what it means to underestimate a veteran. As the man continued his mockery, something unexpected began to happen. I didn't need words, nor exaggerated gestures. I simply began to move with a certainty that only those who have survived know how to have. Each step of my cane seemed to echo not only on the wet concrete, but in the consciences of the people around me. It was as if suddenly, the air heavy with scorn transformed into something heavy with silent respect. Then I heard a firm, recognizing voice behind me. "Wait a moment, are you Sergeant Holloway?" I turned and saw a man in an old uniform, now civilian, staring intently. My heart leaped unexpectedly, and something inside me ignited. People nearby began to whisper, curiosity replacing mockery. The man who had been teasing me recoiled, confused, his smile beginning to tremble. He clearly hadn't expected my story to become known. The man in uniform began to approach, and with each step, more details of my past emerged on the street, like fragments of memories being narrated aloud. He spoke of battles, deserts, risky operations, and the men I lost by my side. Each word was a blade of truth that cut through the provocateur's arrogance, making the crowd feel the weight of my life, a weight he could never comprehend. The man who had been mocking me took a step back, his smile now replaced by surprise and, perhaps, fear. He looked at me, trying to find some sign of weakness, but found only the firmness of a man who had faced far more than mockery. My past, until then invisible to him, was becoming a reality before everyone's eyes. It was impossible to ignore. That old man with the cane was not just someone to be ridiculed. He was a war veteran, someone who had faced real dangers that no one there could even imagine. People started looking at him, not at me anymore. Some young people who were laughing now looked away, ashamed. Other passers-by began to murmur amongst themselves, recognizing the weight of the situation. And at that moment, I realized that the humiliation was about to be reversed. The entire city, even without knowing it intimately, began to feel the respect that my silence and my presence demanded. The uniformed man moved even closer and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "He saved lives you can't even imagine, faced dangers you'll never know. And you, young man, dared to mock him?" The crowd was now completely silent. Every previous laugh faded, replaced by an atmosphere of silent reverence. The provocateur stood motionless, his arrogance replaced by an uncomfortable feeling of guilt. He had no way out. The reversal was complete. The one who tried to humiliate me was suddenly underestimated in the face of the very truth that was being revealed. My cane, once a source of mockery, now became a symbol of the resistance, courage, and survival that only those who have lived it can recognize. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just the respect of others, but the silent satisfaction of justice. My story, silent for years, was finally emerging. Every step, every scar, every painful memory was being validated before the entire city. The world, at least at that instant, understood that a veteran is not defined by appearance, but by the life they built facing the unimaginable. The man who had previously ridiculed me began to back away, confused, ashamed, and powerless before the truth that imposed itself as an impossible force to ignore. The crowd now looked at me differently. Curiosity transformed into respect, mockery into silent admiration. And there, amidst the rain, I realized that the turnaround wasn't just about him or me. It was about everyone who witnessed that moment, reminding us that value and courage are not measured by what we see, but by what we live. The silence that followed the revelation of my past was almost palpable, heavy with a tension that, minutes before, had seemed unbearable. The man who had laughed at me now seemed smaller than any obstacle I had ever faced in my life. His hunched shoulders, his fleeting gaze, his hand trembling slightly, all signs of the truth I carried had finally prevailed. But it wasn't just that brought justice. It was a public acknowledgement, the weight of the words spoken, and the collective consciousness that formed there on the wet street under the constant rain. Some passers-by who had been whispering began to approach, their eyes attentive, curious, and reverent. A young man, who minutes before had been recording my humiliation with his cell phone, now looked at me with respect and a slight apologetic smile on his face. I felt a lump in my throat as I realized that this instant changed not only the perception of the instigator, but of everyone who witnessed the scene. The truth about who I really am could no longer be ignored. The man in the old uniform, who began to reveal my past, remained by my side, speaking calmly, explaining the operations I'd been in, the dangers I had faced, the colleagues I had lost. Each detail, each memory recounted, transformed the scene of humiliation into an act of public recognition. People who didn't know me began to murmur, mentioning names I didn't even remember being mentioned in old news reports about battles and risky missions. It was as if the entire city had received a lesson in courage, survival, and dignity, something the provocateur could never understand with empty words and mockery. And then, something unexpected happened. An elderly lady, who had been observing everything from her apartment, hurried down the stairs and approached, firmly holding my hands. "You fought for this country, and for people you didn't even know. Never let anyone diminish your worth, sir," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. The emotion at that moment hit me like a powerful wave. I felt every physical and emotional scar being acknowledged, every painful memory being validated. The man who had ridiculed me recoiled even further, now embarrassed and, for the first time, aware that his arrogance had a price. The entire city seemed to witness the transformation. The old man with the cane was no longer an object of scorn. I was a silent symbol of courage, dignity, and resilience. Humiliation turned into justice, mockery into respect, and ignorance into public recognition. Some people began to approach, shaking my hand, touching my shoulder, murmuring words of admiration and gratitude. Even strangers driving by slowed down to wave or offer words of respect. The feeling of being recognized, of finally having my story respected, was intense, almost overwhelming. Each step of the cane now seemed laden with meaning, not weakness. The provocateur, now speechless, watched in silence. There was no escape. All the negative energy he had emitted dissipated before the truth that emerged from me and the collective reaction of the city. I felt at that moment that justice didn't need to be sought through revenge or violence. It was in the eyes and words of those who finally understood the weight of my life and my choices. And so, in that moment of recognition, I understood something essential. True justice doesn't come only from courts or laws. It comes from truth being acknowledged, courage being respected, sacrifice being validated. The entire city, witnessing the scene, became complicit in this silent justice. I no longer needed to prove anything, for my story spoke for itself. A feeling of relief and dignity washed over me, a wave that mixed emotion and memory. I felt that, despite everything, I was not alone. The injustice had been faced, the contempt had been overcome, and finally, recognition had arrived, firm and undeniable. The city, even if only for a few brief minutes, understood the value of a veteran. As the city finally began to understand who I truly was, I felt something profound stir within me, something that wasn't just about external recognition, but about internal reconciliation. Every scar, every painful memory, every lost friend, and every night of fear began to align, as if the weight of my entire life was being placed in its proper place. I sat on a nearby bench, my cane resting beside me, and took a deep breath, feeling the still fine rain dampen my face. The memories came rushing back. The smell of gunpowder on the battlefields, the bitter taste of fear in my mouth, the cold touch of metal on my hands as I carried equipment and wounded soldiers. I saw again the faces of those who didn't survive, comrades who trusted me, who believed I would protect them, and whose fate ended in the hands of cruel and unavoidable circumstances. Each memory brought back an old pain, but now, mixed with the respect and understanding of the city, there seemed to be a kind of silent relief. I remembered long nights in damp tents, listening to distant explosions and trying to calm terrified men, afraid that the next attack would be their last. I remembered the loneliness I felt returning home, the silence that seemed to scream louder than any battle. And now, as I watched the people around me finally acknowledge my story, I felt that all that pain, all that anguish had found some kind of balance. My mind also returned to moments of hope, letters received from family, small victories on the battlefields, the feeling of a duty fulfilled even when all seemed lost. These memories, though less intense, had a bittersweet quality, reminding me that, even amidst war and pain, there was humanity, friendship, and quiet courage. The man who had ridiculed me earlier passed by me, now in silence, avoiding eye contact. There was no satisfaction in revenge, only a silent realization of the difference between appearance and reality, between ignorance and experience. I no longer needed to prove anything to him. The city itself had become witness to my story, validating every step I took, every scar I carried, and every decision I made. As I observed the surrounding streets, I realized that my journey wasn't just about me. It was about all those who, at some point, were underestimated, humiliated, or ignored. The experience I carried could serve as a reminder that courage, dignity, and worth cannot be measured by physical strength or youth, but by resilience, sacrifice, and the heart of those who face the impossible. There was also a feeling of fragility and vulnerability, because war never truly ends. The memories, the traumas, and the scars remain alive within me, even as the world around me finally acknowledges my story. But now, with this acknowledgement and understanding, I felt that these inner wounds could finally transform into strength, into a kind of quiet peace that arises when the truth is recognized. And in that instant, as the rain washed over the street and respectful gazes fixed upon me, I realized something essential. The empathy people began to feel wasn't just for me, but for every individual who carries an invisible story. My life, with its struggles and pain, became a bridge, a reminder that everyone has silent battles that deserve to be recognized and respected, even when appearances suggest fragility or weakness. I felt connected to the city, to the people, to the world that had previously seemed indifferent. Every memory, every scar, and every sacrifice was being seen, understood, and, for the first time in a long time, respected. The feeling was profound, almost spiritual, a confirmation that, even after years of suffering, courage and dignity always find their place, even in the most improbable circumstances. The street was silent, except for the constant sound of rain falling on the wet asphalt, creating small puddles that reflected the gray light of the day. The man who had ridiculed me still stood there, his gaze a mixture of disbelief and anger, but there was something more now. Fear. I could see in his face that he finally understood the extent of the story I carried, and that his mockery was no longer power, but powerlessness. Then, a scream cut through the air, coming from a side street. A child had slipped in one of the puddles, about to be hit by a car that was coming too fast, out of control. Time seemed to slow down. All eyes turned to the scene, but no one moved quickly enough. My instinct took over immediately. Without a second thought, I stepped forward. My cane tapped on the ground, each step carrying with it the strength that years of military training had etched into my body. I felt my heart race, adrenaline coursing through my veins as in the days of battle, when every decision could mean life or death. I ignored the pain in my knees and arms that supported my weight. At that moment, nothing else mattered but the child's life. The man who had ridiculed me retreated even further, watching helplessly. The crowd was paralyzed, unable to act, and I realized, for the first time, that this moment could be the ultimate test. The car approached quickly, the driver probably unaware of the child in the puddle. My mind processed the situation in fractions of a second, like on the days when I had to save comrades from explosions or ambushes. I reached the child in time. I grabbed her by the arms firmly and pulled her out of the car's path seconds before impact. The car braked sharply, and the driver honked, visibly shaken. The crowd erupted in murmurs of relief and admiration. My body trembled, not only from the effort, but from the intensity of the moment. I looked at the child, now safe in my arms, and felt a wave of emotion almost impossible to control. The man who had ridiculed me was now completely silent, his eyes wide, finally understanding that my courage wasn't just about past battles, but about action and presence in the present. He had underestimated not only my history, but also my capacity to protect and act. Every previous laugh turned into silent embarrassment, and the entire city now witnessed the true extent of my courage. People began to gather around, some applauding, others murmuring words of respect and gratitude. I held the child securely for a few seconds, feeling both of their quickened breathing, before turning her to the worried arms of her mother, who was crying with relief. In that moment, I realized that the final battle was not just against one man's contempt, but against the invisibility that many veterans face every day. My walking stick, once a source of ridicule, now seemed a symbol of resilient strength. Every step I took to save that child demonstrated that courage and dignity do not diminish with age or physical scars. They persist, silent but firm. And then, I felt a complete shift in the atmosphere. The crowd not only respected my story, they admired it. The provocateur, ashamed, retreated completely, unable to contest what he had just witnessed. I, who had previously been the target of humiliation, had transformed contempt into concrete proof of worth, courage, and humanity. At that moment, in the rain and before the whole city, I realized that the true climax was not only in the imminent danger I had saved, but in the absolute revelation that my actions, my past, and my entire life had weight and meaning, that even in the face of mockery and disdain, dignity and courage always find their moment to emerge, and that genuine respect is earned by the undeniable truth of our actions, not by the appearances that others want to impose. The relief I felt after saving the child was intense, but soon mingled with a deeper, almost silent feeling. The awareness that something inside me had changed permanently. The street, which before had seemed like just a scene of humiliation and mockery, was now permeated with recognition and respect. People who moments before had whispered or laughed began to look at me differently. Some applauded discreetly. Others approached to shake my hand or offer words of admiration. The man who had ridiculed me stood there, motionless, visibly shaken. There were no more laughs or taunts, only a feeling of powerlessness in the face of the truth I represented. He finally understood that my life, my courage, and my experience could not be reduced to a frail appearance or a crutch. Every scar, every cautious step, every painful memory now had a clear meaning in everyone's eyes. As I walked slowly along the sidewalk, I felt that the entire city had witnessed something that went beyond momentary recognition. There was silent respect, but also genuine curiosity. Some people began to approach to talk, to hear my story, to understand more about the war days, about the risky missions, about the lost friends, and the fears I still carry. For the first time, I felt that my story was not invisible, that it finally had space and a voice to be heard. The impact of this experience also affected me on a personal level. I began to realize that my own perception of myself had changed. It wasn't just about being recognized by others. It was about accepting that my life, with all its scars and challenges, had intrinsic value, that my courage didn't need constant applause, but deserved to be respected when finally understood. Old feelings of shame and helplessness began to dissipate, replaced by a silent strength that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. In the following days, the story began to spread. The episode was remembered in the city as an example of silent courage and dignity in the face of mockery. People who had never thought about veterans or the weight of a life marked by war began to reflect, to talk, to value experiences and invisible sacrifices. My presence began to be respected in public places, and the cane, which had previously been a source of derision, became a symbol of survival and resilience. Furthermore, I felt changes within myself. I began to interact more with the community, to share stories of struggle in life, to help young people who felt invisible or underestimated. I discovered that my experience could serve as a lesson and inspiration, showing that even in the face of contempt and injustice, it is possible to maintain dignity and find opportunities to positively impact the world around us. And almost unexpectedly, I felt a silent reconciliation with the ghosts of war. The painful memories remained, but now they were accompanied by something deeper. The certainty that I survived, that my choices and sacrifices matter, and that true courage does not depend on immediate recognition, but reveals itself when it is inevitable. The city changed with me that day, just as I changed with it. People began to look beyond appearances, to value quiet courage, and to reflect on their own humanity. And I, James Holloway, a veteran scarred by war, pain, and time, finally felt that my story was complete. Not because it ended, but because it was finally understood. As I walked back home, my cane tapping rhythmically on the wet ground, I felt a quiet peace. I knew there would still be challenges, that I would still face judgmental stares and disdainful situations, but something inside me had changed. The experience had shown me that dignity and courage are not lost, that recognition can arise even in the most unlikely places, and that life goes on, but never in the same way again. As I walked alone down the now silent street, my cane rhythmically tapping on the wet ground, I realized something I had tried to ignore for many years. The true battle of life is often not fought on the battlefield, but in how we confront the judgment and ignorance of those around us. That day, which began with mockery and derision, ended as proof that courage, dignity, and worth cannot be reduced to physical appearances or the opinions of others. War taught me many lessons, some cruel, others valuable. I learned to cope with fear, loss, suffering, and the death of comrades. But the deepest lesson, perhaps the most lasting, was that the true weight of courage is demonstrated not only in moments of physical danger, but in the ability to maintain integrity, compassion, and moral fortitude in the face of contempt, injustice, and indifference. The experience of that day, being ridiculed and then recognized, made this clearer than ever. Reflecting on the city's reaction, I realized that we often underestimate those who seem weak or incapable. We judge by appearance, by the immediate past, or by stereotypes that society insists on imposing. But the value of a human being is not measured by what is visible, by what can be superficially assessed. It is measured by what we carry inside, by our actions when no one is watching, and by the way we react when confronted with injustice. The man who ridiculed me was merely a reflection of what we all face in different forms: disrespect, ignorance, and hasty judgment. But the response to these situations doesn't have to be anger or revenge. It can simply be living according to our truth, demonstrating dignity, and, when necessary, allowing our actions to speak louder than words or mockery. The episode with the child I saved was a reminder that our lives, even after years of pain, loss, and struggle, still have an impact. No matter the age, the appearance, or the scars, what we do, how we react, and what we choose to value can change the world around us, even if silently and gradually. True courage lies in acting according to principles, even when others don't immediately see or understand. As I looked out over the city, I felt a deep connection with those who witnessed what happened. I realized that everyone carries invisible battles, traumas, and fears that cannot be assessed at first glance. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: respecting the history and experience of others, even if silent and invisible, is an act of humanity that transcends any momentary judgment or mockery. Now, with a cane in my hands and scars on my body, I can walk with a clear conscience. I know that my story has been heard, understood, and acknowledged, and that the courage and dignity I have carried throughout my life were not in vain. I have learned that the war does not end when we leave the battlefield. It continues in the form of moral challenges, in the fight against contempt, and in the relentless pursuit of respect and understanding. And if there's one thing I want everyone who has heard or witnessed my story to remember, it's that true strength isn't visible. It isn't immediate, and often goes unnoticed until it's impossible to ignore. Every scar, every cautious step, every painful memory has value. Every life marked by effort and perseverance deserves to be recognized. The final reflection is simple, yet powerful. Never underestimate the veteran, the elderly, the invisible, or those who carry silent scars. We all have stories that define who we are, and these stories are worthy of respect, understanding, and admiration. The world can be cruel and unjust, but there's always a moment when the truth emerges, revealing courage and humanity, even in the most unlikely places. As I continue on my way, feeling the rain wash over the concrete of the street, I realize that life goes on, and that every act of dignity, every gesture of silent courage, leaves a mark that time and injustice can never erase. And above all, I know that true victory lies not in humiliating or being humiliated, but in remaining true to one's own history and capable of inspiring others, even in the most unexpected circumstances.